A face-off followed on the street, with police in riot gear going up against the demonstrators, a barricade being shoved back and forth between them, and the protesters eventually scattering.
It was entirely peaceful the entire time until the police showed up. A couple of us just got singled out, isolated, and punched and beaten on the ground for a while.
We will continue to assist the university as required to remove any further encampments and to remove anyone else who has been trespassed and refuses to leave that property.
First, let me begin by being absolutely clear. We stand with Israel and reaffirm our support for Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international law.
Across Canada and across the globe, there has been a wave of state violence and repression against protesters and encampments set up in solidarity with Palestine. The movement against Western imperialism, the student movement, and the workers' movement are beginning to run up against the obstacle of the existing state. Members of the RCP have been at the forefront of these struggles. We've helped set up encampments and defend them against repression. And most importantly, we've brought our ideas into this movement to try to give a Marxist position on what must be done. The question of how we approach the state is fundamentally a life and death question for these movements. And it is a life and death question for revolutionaries. And so it is on this topic that we will be kicking off our series on the fundamental ideas of Leninism, with today's episode on the state and revolution. This will be the first episode in a series dedicated to Lenin's contributions to revolutionary philosophy, revolutionary theory, and tactics. To learn about Lenin's contribution to the revolutionary movement and how we can apply his insights into the struggle today. Hello again, comrades, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Revolutionary Communist Podcast. This week, we're going to be discussing a topic that is, I think, coming onto a lot of people's minds, especially because earlier this afternoon I read in the news that the encampment that had been set up just a day or two ago at York University was shut down by the police. We've also seen similar repression at the University of Alberta, the University of Calgary, where actually the repression was quite brutal. I know a lot of students were arrested, some were hospitalized. And so this week we're going to be discussing with Marco La Grotta, a leading member of the Canadian section of the International Marxist Tendency, the soon-to-be Revolutionary Communist International, about the question of the state and the relevance of this question to the work of revolutionaries here in Canada and around the world today under the current circumstances. So, Marco, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on.
So what are your thoughts, given everything that we've seen in recent months around the world? What's the relevance of the state today?
I mean, it's exactly like you've described. I mean, the thing about the state under capitalism is that in most normal circumstances, most people don't really see the state. It's sort of something that operates in the background and only gets called into service when necessary. Now, with this Palestine solidarity movement, we have one of those moments where sort of you don't have the normal functioning of society. You have a movement which is now posing a threat to these university administrations, and which, more broadly speaking, it poses a threat to the system. It poses a threat to these governments. And so we're seeing the response. You know, you mentioned University of Alberta, Calgary. Again, you have you don't have the normal functioning of society any longer. We've seen these protests, they've been growing, they've been spreading from university to university. And from the perspective of the administration, that they can't allow that. They need peace and order. So what do they do when they need peace and order? They send in what Lenin once called the armed bodies of men of the state to restore order. And in Alberta, we've seen it broken up, these encampments, in quite a dramatic fashion. In fact, some of our own comrades were caught up in this, you know, coming in with billy clubs, firing tear gas and all these sorts of things. We had people who were hospitalized, and ultimately they achieved their aims, which was to quash this movement. It's the same thing that we're seeing presently at York. And I think it's something that we can expect to see more of, because We don't live in normal times anymore. Protests are becoming more and more common, not just on the issue of Palestine, but cost of living issues. We might tomorrow have a strike of the transit workers in Toronto. And I can guarantee if that strike goes on and it goes beyond the normal limits of your normal strike, you might have the question of the state surface there as well. The back to work legislation, even sending in the police. Right? That's the role that the state plays under capitalism. And we're beginning to see it. And I think for a lot of people, a few years ago this would have been an abstract question. But now you're seeing it play out in a very real way on these campuses, on the picket lines. So I'd say, yes, it's a very modern question. And especially as Marxists, it's a question that we're intimately concerned with for those reasons.
Mm. No, I think the point that you brought up about the TTC workers and their potential strike tomorrow is actually a very important one. Because I've already seen in a lot of bourgeois newspapers certain right-wing pundits calling for the strike to be basically broken or outlawed before it even actually begins, talking about what an effect this would have on Toronto's economy. This is going to make life worse for everyone. And I think it really shows whose interests a lot of these institutions tend to run for. And whether in disguise or openly, they do see the police as an instrument of controlling the situation, of maintaining, business as usual for a lot of these industries.
And I think it's an important point about the trade unions, because like I said, in most normal times, you don't see the sort of naked face of the state, if you'd like. Because with the ruling class, they have lots of ways of controlling the movement. And when it comes to the trade unions, actually I would say the more preferred method is not relying on the billy club. It's relying on the trade union leaders. Because in most cases, you have sellout agreement after sellout agreement. You don't have the same kind of militant strikes that you would have seen, for example, in the 60s and 70s. In most cases, they can count on the trade union leaders to sort of keep the movement within orderly limits. But we're in a situation now where you've got pressures because of the cost of living. Workers are in a ferment. We have comrades in the ATU, which is the union that represents the transit workers. And I think it was one of their co-workers who said, this isn't just about wages. He said, this is about revenge, which I think it reveals the state. And I think there's a point here because, yes, the trade union leaders may have been able to keep the movement within certain limits for a period. But at a certain point, that reaches its limits, which means that the ruling class will have to rely on new tools. Right? And again, it's more reason that we need to study this question of the state. It's not just an abstract question. It's preparation for the working class movement, the obstacles that we're going to face.
No, I think that's a very good point. And that kind of leads organically to my next question, which is actually about what is the state? We're Marxists, we're a revolutionary Marxist organization. You mentioned a lot of the existing trade union leadership. They tend to approach the state as if it's this neutral arbiter that exists above society. It's there to balance everyone's interests, to keep harmony. And in the way that a lot of trade union leaders today and historically have approached these sorts of struggles, they are more often than not willing to bend over backwards to find some sort of compromise, some sort of reconciliation, even if the state or the bosses that they're negotiating with are totally unwilling to negotiate. And so it ends up being, a race to the bottom in some cases. I took some political science classes when I was back in university, where basically the gist of the argument was, society is just so complex. We can't keep track of everything. There has to be some organization to keep everyone in line, or we're all inherently evil. There needs to be some sort of system to keep us orderly, to hold society together. What do Marxists have to say in the face of all these, different interpretations of what the state is? What is the state to Marxists?
I mean, there's an element of truth in what your political science professor said. It is meant to retain order, but of course it's a question of order for whom. It's not a way of sort of maintaining this kind of social pact in society. It's a tool for maintaining the order of the ruling class. And the state, I think the best description is the one that Lenin gave. I mentioned it already. So Lenin described the state as the armed bodies of men in defense of private property. So what does that mean? It's all the institutions at the disposal of the capitalist regime for maintaining order in society. That's the military, the police, but also you can include in that the court system. It's a very important tool, especially in Canada, when we talk about, for example, back-to-work legislation and so on. The courts are a very important element of the state. And you mentioned also another factor which sometimes get overlooked, which is the trade union leaders, which in a sense have become ensnared and almost you can say sort of enveloped by the capitalist state. Actually, there's a very good text by Leon Trotsky. I believe it's called Trade Unions in the Epoch of Imperialist Decay. It's a very good book. It's not one that people often read. It's a shorter one, but a very good one. But the point he makes is that the trade unions in the past had the trade union leadership had a more organic connection to the working class. But what happened, and what he points out in this text, says as the trade unions grew and as capitalism started to develop and sort of perfect its machinery, what there was a tendency to sort of envelop and bring in this upper layer of the trade union leadership and essentially transform them into an appendage of the capitalist state. And you see that in Canada, especially after the Second World War. You had a sort of kind of legalization of the trade union movement, if you'd like, which had its positive sides, but it also had its negative sides. That a lot of these trade union leaders essentially are now in a position where they are strictly operating within the confines of the bourgeois courts, which places very severe limits on what they can do. And of course, what those limits are the limits set by the capitalists. In other words, they've said to the trade union leaders, you can go this far, but no further. And up until now, most trade union leaders have accepted that. Right? If you told them, we need to break the law, they say, oh, you can't do that. Of course, the trade union movement, how it was established, they were illegal for years. Trade unions wouldn't exist if it weren't for defying the capitalist state, if it weren't for defying capitalist laws. But we're beginning to see a resurgence of that. Because at the end of the day, no law is more powerful than the needs of the working class. There's an old saying in the movement, it's better to break the law than to break the poor. And I think there's a layer within the movement which is beginning to grasp that idea. Right? And if the trade union leaders aren't going to meet those demands, they're going to be swept out of the way. Right? But again, that doesn't end the question of the state. Right? Because the workers are going to face the courts, the police, at a certain stage, the army. Of course, we're not at that. Certain countries are at that stage where they will send in the army when the workers' protests, social movements, and so on. So that army exists in reserve, always. That's what the state is. The armed bodies of men in defense of private property. Lenin said that over 100 years ago. It's just as true today as it was then. Certain things have changed. At the end of the day, the fundamental character of the state is exactly the same.
There's even a precedent for what you were just talking about, that workers begin to recognize the need to break laws that are designed to break them. And that's the education workers' strike 2 years ago in Ontario. The workers were faced with back-to-work legislation, the notwithstanding clause, by the Doug Ford government. They defied it, they broke the law, and they forced the government to back down. I think that demonstrates, even just in a microcosm, this process that goes on at all revolutionary moments, or in all of these mass movements that break from the limitations imposed by bourgeois legality, the laws that are in place to maintain order of the capitalist system. And it's a necessary part of any movement. But this also raises the question, I think, of, You know, if we're talking about the state as special bodies of armed men, you can look back through history. You can look at Canada today or other countries that exist around the world today. These states don't look identical to one another. It actually has a variety of forms, and it's served a variety of different ruling classes. How has the state changed over history? Where does it come from? How did it originate?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's an enormous question.
Enormous. It's an unfair question.
It's a fair question. But it's a big one, because you're talking about really the history of human development. Now, obviously, we can't plumb the depths of that discussion here. But if I could make a suggestion, the text that I would say deals with this question in a Marxist way, the origins of the state. Engels has a very good book, Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which goes into this question in some depth. Essentially, it's important to point out the state, just like capitalism, has not always existed. That for all of the time that humans have been on this earth, for the vast majority of that time, over 90% of that time, they lived and conducted their lives outside of the state, right, and outside of what we would call class society. Right? If you look at sort of tribes and stuff that predated the development of class society, the state emerges at a particular point in human development, and it has its origins in what Marxists would call the productive forces within society. That, in other words, when society reaches a certain level of development, specifically what we call the development of a surplus. Essentially what that means is a society which has reached such a level of development that it's able to produce goods above and beyond the means of subsistence for that tribe or group of people. It's important to point out that even though the state didn't exist in pre-class society, it wasn't for moral reasons. It's not that the biological programming of humans was different back then. It's that the conditions were different back then. You didn't have the conditions that would have necessitated the existence of a state. In fact, in those sorts of societies, everyone was compelled to work and share the goods of the tribe in common. Because if they didn't do that, the entire tribe would perish. So the whole idea of an apparatus standing above society would have been totally foreign to most people living in pre-class society. But once you reach a level of development, societies become more productive. You have the development of agriculture, the development of a surplus. For the first time, you have a layer of the population which becomes removed from the rest of the pack, which now has control over this surplus, hoarding this surplus. It frees them up to do other things. They don't have to work in the same way anymore. It's also, this is the origins of what we call mental labor. Right? For the first time in history, people were freed up to do other things. And it had its progressive role, right? Because it allowed people to study, study the cosmos, study the flow of water, led to advances in production, technology, and so on. But at a certain point, you've got all of this stuff. At a certain point, the rest of the tribe, the rest of the community, isn't so happy that it's one guy or two guys or whatever that now have control over all of this stuff. How do you keep it? Right? How do you stop people from rising up, taking it away? How you do that is with a state. Now, obviously, in the early days, it takes a very primitive form, right? The American army didn't come fully formed into existence, thousands of years ago. It took on a more primitive form. But essentially, what Engels explains is that the formation of the state has its origins, in other words, in the development of class society. That it's not until society separates into these classes, a surplus is produced, a layer of the population, a minority of the population, now controls the majority of the wealth. It's only in those specific conditions that the institution that we call as the state comes into existence. And what we see is that as society becomes more developed, as it produces more and more and more, and as the rich become more and more wealthy and more powerful, the need for a bigger state grows. And so you go from the very, primitive states that would have existed thousands of years ago to the more complex states, for example, that you saw in, Greece and Rome. But these were much more developed societies. They had much more means at their disposal. And they had a lot more reason to protect their stuff, right, from the slaves, from everybody else in society. And it's the same rule in every class society. Right? It always looks a bit different, but it's the same basic laws that apply. A division in society, the only way that the ruling class can maintain order is through its state. Its armed bodies of men, its laws, which are always laws drafted by the rich and powerful. We saw that in slavery, we saw that in feudalism, and we see that in capitalism. Right?
So, one argument or one idea that a lot of people tend to come across in the movement, that for the working class to actually change society, it has to work within the existing state. So here in Canada, that would mean getting members elected to parliament, taking government positions. It's similar to the process that you described with the trade union movement, incremental, slow transformation of society. Are the reformists correct in taking this approach?
Oh no, they're completely wrong. They're totally wrong. The thing is with the state, it is always and has always been a organ of class rule, but it can take on different forms. In terms of what we would call bourgeois democracy, parliamentary democracy in Canada and United States and Britain, it's actually Lenin that made a good point about this, that parliamentary democracy is actually in many ways the preferred form of rule for the ruling class. Because in parliamentary democracy, first of all, it's very cheap. Right? Cheap in the sense that it's easier to keep the parliament than, for example, to install a military dictatorship. Right? Paying
less wages to armed
thugs. Also the same attitude to the trade unions. Keep wages low, keep expenses down. It's a cheaper form of government. They don't have to pay this, military regime to keep control over society. That's one element. The other element is that, Lenin makes the point, it also creates a sort of release valve for capitalism. So in other words, okay, you don't like what the liberals are doing, that's fine. In 4 years or 8 years, you get to vote for the conservatives. And then in another 4 years or another 8 years, you get to vote for the liberals again. In Canada, whether it's the liberals or the conservatives in power, you can bet that the bankers and corporations are still firmly in the saddle. So what they have there, it's a nice sort of exchanging of roles. It's a release valve. Right? You can allow frustration to crystallize against one party, but then you swap them out for another party. So this is very useful to the capitalists. At the end of the day, they still make all of the important decisions. Right? They still control the wealth in society. Even if you have a left-wing government come to power, we've seen this happen many times. They don't like what that government's doing. They have plenty of ways to bringing them in line. Like for example, we had in Ontario back in the 90s the Bob Rae government, NDP. As this wasn't a communist party. It's even a stretch to call it a left-wing party. But nonetheless, they were proposing certain reforms that the capitalists in Ontario were not too pleased about. So what did they do? They put pressure on this government from the outside. They took out ads in all of the newspapers. They called for a capital strike in Ontario. In fact, they even took out billboards along the 401, which I think was a photo of Bob Rae next to, I think it was Che Guevara, to sort of, frighten people. They had this whole scaremongering campaign. They used their newspapers. They threatened to pull out capital. They used every means at their disposal. And what was the result? The government towed the line. The government towed the line. And this is essentially the story of every social democratic party that's ever come to power in any country. Right? They come to power. If their interests don't align with those of the capitalists make sure that eventually they will toe the line. That's what it is. We have a political democracy in the sense, but as Lenin said, it's the freedom to vote for someone to misrepresent you every 4 years. But what we don't have is economic democracy. At the end of the day, the ruling class still controls all of the media. They control all of the wealth. They have 1,001 means at their disposal for making sure that they stay in the saddle. I don't know about you, but that's not what I would call a genuine democracy. So yes, you get to vote. But what are the options? The options are capitalist 1 and capitalist 2. It's not much of an option.
Yeah, you gave the example of Bob Ray. Even going back further to the 1970s, I think in Chile under Allende, there's also another example of what can happen to a government, even if I know Allende, he was a self-proclaimed socialist or a self-proclaimed Marxist. And he did try to implement certain reforms to benefit the Chilean working class, the poor, the oppressed. And what was the end consequence of this? The Chilean ruling class, with the backing of the American state, had Allende murdered. They killed thousands of communists, trade unionists, socialists, youth. They executed them en masse, and then they implemented the Pinochet dictatorship. So it's kind of similar to what you were talking about, where the mask of democracy begins to slip, or where democracy gets out of the control of the ruling class of that country, of the major imperialist powers. Then you see the baton, you see tear gas, you see the gun, replace it as the instrument of maintaining order in society.
And you also see here, I mean, this is a much more advanced example, because you've got this idea from reformists, from liberals, that, we have our Constitution, and the Constitution is almost like this sacred document that's going to protect us. And Allende, for all of his strengths, and I certainly have a lot more respect for an Allende than a Bob Ray, that's for certain. But for all his strengths, one of his key weaknesses is, again, this sort of reformist illusion in the Constitution, right? That Allende was convinced that Pinochet and the rest of the generals would respect the Constitution. That, in other words, we have our democratic mandate. These are the policies we're going to carry out. We're doing it within the realm of the law, and you need to respect that. But the problem is the capitalists do not respect that. As much as they'll sort of wax lyrical about their love for the law and the Constitution, the minute it poses a problem for them, they're going to do exactly what they did in Chile. Pinochet said, okay, well, very well. Out goes the Constitution, out goes the Parliament, in come the military men, in come the tanks, and they held their power by other means. Now, obviously, he's talking about a much more developed class struggle in Chile. But these are the rules by which the capitalists play. It's a total illusion, and we would be, I think, misdirecting working people if we said, if we operate within the realms of the law, that's sufficient. The capitalists, first of all, write the laws, and if they need to violate their own laws, they will. Which begs the question, if the capitalists won't respect their laws, why on earth should working people respect their laws?
Well, I guess on the flip side, reacting against this reformist approach towards the state, there are a lot of, or at least historically, there have been quite a few anarchist organizations in Canada, especially in Quebec. There was a strong anarchist tradition, which basically took the position that what we needed to do at the end of the day was abolish the state outright from moment one. Is this an effective approach for revolutionaries to take in a revolutionary period? Is this a solution?
I mean, it's certainly what I would want. It's what any Marxist would want. Listen, there's this, I think, confusion about what Marxists stand for. Sometimes you hear, oh, well, the anarchists are against the state and the Marxists are for the state, or something like this. And it's totally false. It's totally false. Marxists and anarchists actually share this in common. We are both against the state. Actually, if I can go back to Lenin, the way that Lenin referred to the state, and not just the capitalist state, I would add, but a workers' state in Soviet Russia, the way he described it was a necessary evil. Those were always the words that Lenin used, a necessary evil. What was he saying here? If it were possible from day one to make the state disappear, skip over the stage of a workers' state, any, I think, sensible person would want that, right? If it were possible. But the problem is that we live in reality. We live in reality. And the fact is, and I think history is proof of this, that in order to overcome the capitalist state, because the thing with the capitalists, they are highly organized. The capitalist state is the highest and most perfected form of organization, of class rule. They have all kinds of means at their disposal for keeping the working class at bay. The workers need to be organized too, right? In the same way. Otherwise, the first moment they move against capitalism, they're going to be shattered to bits by the capitalist state. But that form of organization, what that is a state, is a workers' state. If workers are organizing across a country, building a military to fight the capitalist military, with their own rules, with their own customs, that is a state. It's a necessary tool in the transition from capitalism to socialism. Now, also as Marxists, we believe that over time, as society becomes more developed, as we reach what we call a society of superabundance, the need for that kind of tool of repression, if you like, withers away over time. But when we're talking about a revolution, again, when you're up against the most perfected form of organization in the capitalist state, you're damn right the workers deserve a state. They need a state. Right? It's not a moral question. It's a practical question. Are we going to win, or are we going to get shattered to bits? And history, again, is instructive here. It's Spain, which is often it's an event that the anarchists point to, the Spanish Revolution in the 30s. It's also an event that Marxists point to. Now, it's seen as sort of the high point of anarchism. In certain ways, it was. I would say the best and bravest fighters in the Spanish Revolution were the anarchist workers organized in the CNT. Of that, there's no doubt. But there was a serious defect with the CNT, that it was allergic to the idea of workers' power. In fact, many times throughout the Spanish Civil War, they had an opportunity of seizing state power, and they did not, for principled reasons. And what was the result? Franco counted his blessings, retreated, built up an army, and drowned the working class in blood, drowned the revolution in blood. The reason we need a workers' state is to prevent that, right? Because the capitalists have this state and the workers will need this state. It's a very practical question.
So in the process of a revolution, what you're saying is it's necessary for the working class to actually smash the existing state machinery, like the state that's been designed to hold them in place, to protect bourgeois domination over society. And that requires an instrument. It requires the workers to organize themselves, to defend themselves, and essentially to defend the gains of the revolution, to take society under their own control and to hold back the old owners of society.
Well, it's exactly that. Right? The capitalists have their weapons, and the working class needs its weapons. Right? The working class needs to be organized, because otherwise they're going to be smashed to bits. Right? And the history of the working class, unfortunately, very often, is the working class getting smashed to bits. Right? It needs organization, especially during a revolution. Especially during a revolution. And that's what a workers' state is. But, yes, we support smashing the capitalist state. Actually, this was an interesting little historical fact with the Communist Manifesto. As far as I'm aware, Marx only ever made one revision to the Communist Manifesto. And the revision that he made was to include the need for smashing the bourgeois state, which is a lesson that Marx drew from the Paris Commune of 1871, which I recommend the listeners read those writings if they want to learn about what Marx had to say about the state. Marx's writings on France are a very good place to start. But he said it was not sufficient for the working class, he said, to grab hold of the ready-made capitalist state. It needed to be smashed. And what he meant by that is that you needed to clear out all of the old generals, officers, police chiefs, judges, all of these types, right? All of the things, all of the pieces that make up the capitalist state needs to be swept into the dustbin of history. When we talk about a worker state, we're talking about an entirely new form of organization, a democratic organization based on the workers' organizations. In Russia, that was the Soviets, which were an organic creation of the Russian working class in 1905. In other countries, the trade unions. Every country will be different. But when we talk about a workers' state, again, we're not talking about the old state with and now you put up some communist banners and it's a communist state. Every last institution of that old state must be destroyed. Every last general, every last officer, every last police chief, every last judge needs to hit the dust. And new organizations need to be built, democratic organizations of working people. That's what we mean when we say a workers' state. It's fundamentally a different idea from what the capitalists have.
I guess to return to a point that you brought up, like we're talking about society in the midst of a revolutionary upheaval. What is a revolution? Because especially here in Canada, I mean, I've never seen one in my lifetime. A lot of people, revolutions are something you read about in history books at the very best. It's this hazy, vague idea. What do we mean when we say a revolution? And in particular, to answer a lot of concerns that I think a lot of people have about revolutionary movements, is this worry of violence. Mm-hmm. That what a revolution means is essentially a bloodbath or a vendetta against a certain layer of people in society. What is a revolution? And does a revolution inherently mean violence?
No, I don't think it does. And I'd also add that as Marxists, I think we got to make it perfectly clear. We do not desire violence. Right? And I don't know who would. Maybe some kind of a sociopath or something like that. As Marxists, we're not the smallest bit interested in violence. What a revolution is, to give a very basic definition, I think it was Trotsky who gave my favorite definition, is that revolution is essentially the masses entering the scene of history. And what he meant by that is a situation where for the first time you have millions of people not just having politics done to them. Because that's the thing, in most ordinary circumstances, politics, let's be honest, is something that's done to the working class. It's the domain of, men in suits, people in Ottawa, people in the C-suite, these boardrooms. These are the people making the decisions. And then imposing their decisions on everybody else. That's what capitalism is. 99% of the time, that's what we've got. A revolution is the 1% of the time where it gets flipped. And for the first time, it's millions of ordinary people making decisions and doing politics themselves with their own organizations, their own rules, their own traditions. Coming out into the streets, occupying the factories, occupying the parliaments. That is what a revolution is. It's the masses entering the scene of history. And I would add that working people have no interest in conducting violence. And in a sense, no need, because the working class, especially today, is overwhelmingly the preponderant majority of society. The capitalists are few and far between. The generals are few and far between. The police chiefs are few and far between. They have guns and tanks and all of this, but we have numbers. Right? And I would also add that the military is not a homogenous block. You sometimes have this attitude on the left that they're all sort of pigs and murderers and so on and so forth. Let's take the military, for example. The important thing about the military is that the military, in a lot of way, reflects the contradictions that exist in society writ large. That there's an officer caste, a general caste, but then you have also millions upon millions of privates, right, who are in every way, in terms of their mentality, in terms of where they live, are working people. And, I'd pose the question, if millions of people in Canada took to the streets to overthrow the government, to say we want a new society, we want to be the ones controlling the banks, controlling the factories, do we really think that, ordinary Canadian soldiers would fire on their brothers and sisters, their aunts and uncles, their former co-workers? Some of them might, but I guarantee you a significant proportion of them would not. And what you would essentially have is a situation, which you have in every revolution, which is the state begins to split on class lines. What does that mean? The soldiers, police even, elements of the judiciary, come to the side of the working class. Right? Or if they don't come to the side of the working class, are paralyzed by the revolution. Right? And essentially, if you can succeed in doing that, it's entirely possible that the revolution can be conducted in an almost entirely peaceful way. It's entirely possible. Now, that doesn't mean if the workers aren't attacked, of course, we need to defend ourselves by every means possible. Mm-hmm. But I do believe, especially today, we have a very large working class, a highly educated society. You have every possibility for a peaceful revolution. Right? We've seen this play out in recent years, in the Egyptian revolution, for example, during the Arab Spring. The army came to the side of the people. Right? The army came to the side of the people. I think you're going to see similar things play out in future revolutions. So this is what we mean. It's not, there was an old, Communist Party pamphlet, the Stalinist Communist Party from the 1930s in Canada, which used to talk about, very soon the streets of Toronto will be running red with the blood of the workers and bourgeoisie. This is fanatical stuff. This is not what we defend. We defend the overwhelming majority of society taking power, and they can do it peacefully. That's what a revolution is.
The point that you made about there being contradictions, even in these bodies of armed men that the state leans on. You look at the example of like Aaron Bushnell, for example, in the United States. He burned himself to death to protest against the United States backing of Israel in their genocide that's taking place in Gaza. You cannot look at that as an event and say, oh, well, everyone in the military is backwards, is reactionary, will inevitably side with the existing ruling class. The contradictions that exist in society, the mood, this sense that something must fundamentally change, inevitably has to permeate into these groups. A lot of people who go into the military, in particular, end up going into the military because they don't honestly have very many other options. They do it to get an education, to find work, for other reasons. They want to serve something that's bigger than themselves, their country. We can't overestimate this, but we have to recognize that this splitting of the state is a key requirement, actually, in every revolutionary process. It's something that we have to think very carefully about and prepare for in advance in order to prevent actual violence, in order to prevent this bloodbath that we can see when there is a failure to win over these layers of the armed bodies, the police, the military.
That's it. And that is, it's not a moral question, because then again, you do have elements on the left that it is sort of a moral question, right? Again, that they're all murderers, they're all killers. right? Denouncing, individual soldiers and so on. This is a stupid way of approaching revolution. With revolution, it's not a moral question. It's not about what makes you feel good inside. It's a practical question, right? Because if the state does not split, the revolution will fail, and the workers will be drowned in blood. It's a practical question, and these divisions do exist. Like you mentioned, Aaron Bushnell. It's just a microcosm, but I guarantee you, there are thousands like him in the American military. Just seen as, the bastion. I mean, it is the bastion of reaction in the world. But there are a lot of ordinary working people in the U.S. military, right? I guarantee you, many who see things the same way as Aaron Bushnell, and many more who will see it that way in the next period. That's who we're aiming at. This is, Lenin, the Russian Revolution. They made an appeal to the Cossacks, which were one of the most reactionary forces in Tsarist Russia. At the time of the revolution, they issued an appeal, and it started with brother Cossacks. They said, "We are workers like you, don't fire on us." They made an appeal to them, right? And some they succeeded in winning, some they didn't. But it was those sort of methods that paved the way for the victory of the Russian Revolution. It's a practical question, I think, is the important point.
Well, to go back to the point that you were making about in the process of smashing the state, the workers need an organization. Essentially, the workers need a state of their own. I mean, you talked about this being a state unlike any other. You talked about it withering away over time with the development of productivity, the creation of a society of abundance. Mm-hmm. But what will this state look like? Because the only examples that really we have historically are these bloated bureaucracies or these military regimes like what we saw in the Soviet Union, what we've seen in China, in other countries around the world that have had so-called communist revolutions. Is this an inevitable consequence of a workers' revolution?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That what existed in these countries, whether it's China, the Soviet Union, was a caricature, a bureaucratic caricature of what genuine communism is and what a genuine worker state is. What a worker state is, in the most simple terms, is a regime of workers' democracy. And that for the first time in history, the majority are calling the shots. That's what a worker state was. I would ask you, is that what existed in the Soviet Union? Is that what existed in China or Romania or in Yugoslavia? Absolutely not. What you had was a planned economy, yes, which led to enormous gains in these countries. There's no denying that. But political power was firmly in the hands of a small bureaucracy, whether it was in Moscow, whether it was in Beijing. Political control was not in the hands of the working class. Now, in the case of Russia, the revolution didn't begin that way. It did begin with a genuine regime of workers' democracy. That was during the period of Lenin and Trotsky. What was that regime based on? I think I mentioned it previously. It was based on the Soviets. And what were the Soviets? The Soviets were an organic creation of the Russian working class in the 1905 revolution. What they were, they started actually as strike committees. They were bodies meant to coordinate the strikes. And they would elect people on the basis of factory units and so on and so forth. They were responsive to the working class, elected by the working class, recallable by the working class, and its members were working class. The delegates were working class. It was 1,000 times more reflective of the aspirations of the workers than any kind of parliament. In another country, you might have the trade unions. It all depends on every country. In the Russian Revolution, it was the Soviets that the Bolsheviks brought to power. Right? In other words, it was the organizations of the working class which held the power in Russia. Now, obviously, that eventually degenerated, and you had the rise of Stalin. That's a separate question. There's circumstances, namely isolation, a very small working class numerically in Russia, the effects of the Civil War, the First World War, which led to the rise of the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. That's a separate question. But it did not start that way. And essentially in all of these countries, rather than a Soviet government, like in 1917, which is what Lenin defended, which is what Trotsky defended, you had essentially carbon copies of the Stalinist regime. This was the case in China. This was the case in Yugoslavia. This was the case really in every country that called itself communist. It wasn't communist in the sense that that we would mean it. Right? We defend the genuine traditions of the Russian Revolution, which is workers' democracy. That's what we support. And like I said, it will take on different forms in different countries. It depends on the working class. It's not for me here in this room to decide, this is what it's going to look like, and this is how the Constitution will look, and this is how we're going to run the elections, and this is how we're going to so on and so forth. It's absurd, right? It's not for some person on a podcast or some intellectual to decide. It'll be decided by the working class, and they will create their own organizations. It might be the trade unions. They might create totally new organizations, right? In the German Revolution of 1918, it was the factory committees that helped to play that role. In other revolutions, in the May 1968 in France, you had action committees that were spread across the country. It all depends on the working class. And that's what we want to bring to power.
And you mentioned this withering away of the state, because when the working class comes to power, it has to defend workers' control over society. What does this withering away of the state look like? What could it look like? Is this just wishful thinking in the way that a lot of anarchists or a lot of critics of Marxism will present it as?
Well, the thing with the workers' state, its existence is a product of scarcity. It's a product of poverty. That if you don't have a society of superabundance, and what we mean by that is a society essentially where you can work as much as you'd like and take as much as you want. In other words, society has become so advanced, technology has become so advanced, so productive, that people can live exactly how they please. There's no need for an institution to sort of keep things in order or compel people to do certain things, because you've reached the end, you've reached communism. But when we talk about that, again, we're not utopians. We don't imagine that the very next day after the revolution, you're going to have a society of superabundance. In fact, in many cases, you'll have the opposite. Most revolutions are massive consumers of energy and resources. That was the case in the Russian Revolution. That was the case in also the French Revolution. It's not unique to the workers' revolutions. It took the economy, I believe, 10 years to recover after the French Revolution. There's going to be a period after the revolution where you'll have dislocation, where you'll have a resistance from the former capitalists and generals and so on and so forth. For that period of time, there needs to exist some kind of form of organization to make sure that people get everything that they need and that the gains of the revolution are defended. But as society becomes more productive, the more productive it becomes, the less need you have for that kind of compulsion. Right? I think it was Trotsky who used the example of, if you have a bread line in society, in order to keep it orderly, you need a policeman on that bread line. But once you reach a society where you no longer need the bread line, you also no longer need the policeman. Obviously, it's a small example, but the same principle applies to the state writ large. As it becomes more productive, the need for the state gradually withers and withers away until it doesn't exist anymore. And instead of the administration of people, you have what Lenin called, the administration of things. You don't have government in the same sense anymore. It dissolves into society. But we're talking about the future. Right? This is not something that happens. Again, we're not anarchists who imagine the day after tomorrow suddenly everything is hunky-dory and everything is perfect, and production is at 1,000%, and the capitalists fly to the moon. We live in the realm of reality. You're going to need a state for a period.
Marco, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening, comrades. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you'd like to learn more on the Marxist view of the state, I can recommend no better book than Lenin's classic State and Revolution. And for a more historical view, I would also recommend Engels' book on the origins of the family, private property, in the state. I'll add links in the show notes where you can find both of these books at our bookstore. And as always, I would appeal to you, if you agreed with the ideas, to get to work putting them into practice in the real world. You can join us through our website, and we can give you everything you need to start building a communist cell wherever you are. That's all for us this week, comrades, but next time, we'll be back with a classic work of Lenin on revolutionary tactics that is extremely applicable to our work today, and that is Lenin's Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. So, don't forget to tune in again next week. See you next time, comrades.